everyone. It's Miss Samantha here, and I just wanted to say hi. We're coming up on a very special holiday, Easter. It's one of my very favorite holidays, and I'm very sad that I can't spend it with you guys this year, and I can't see you guys. But I hope you are having fun with your families, and that you are finding the joy and the love of Christ, even while you are at home in this Easter season. I wanted to read you a book today. And this is called Only God Would Have Planned It That Way. Last week we talked a little bit about how things don't always happen the way that we think they will, or the way that we think that they should. And that happens sometimes. Maybe you're trying to get something done and you have an idea of how to do it, and maybe your friend or your brother or your spouse has a different idea of how to do it, and you might fight about it, and you probably shouldn't fight, but we all have different ideas. God didn't make us all the same, and that's good. That's a very good thing. But our ideas of how to do something are very different than God's ideas of how to do things. And that's what this book is about. So I want to read this to you. It's about the Easter story and God's way of doing things. So this is called Only God Would Have Done It That Way by Todd Barsness, and it's illustrated by Shelley Hohenberger. So, only God would have done it that way. If I would have planned out the Lord's Passion Week, the throngs would be gathered and autographs they'd seek. But fickle-ish crowds would become mad fray. You see, only God would have planned it that way. They do not look very happy. If I would have planned how a conqueror would ride, I'd saddle a stallion with a big haughty stride. That looks pretty fancy and pretty nice. But yet he hopped on a small colt that spring day. You see, only God would have planned it that way. If I would have planned the last meal he'd eat, the best food and guest would be placed at his feet. Yet Christ donned a towel and a meek servant's tray. You see, only God would have planned it that way. If I would have planned how he'd spend his last night, I'd have thrown him a party to bring him delight. That looks pretty fun. I'd like to party right about now. Lots of people. But he wept alone. In a great sorrow he prayed. You see, only God would have planned it that way. Looks pretty sad. If I would have planned how a great king should die, he'd have a grand funeral and thousands would cry. But he hung on a cross on a day dark and gray. You see, only God would have planned it that way. If I would have planned the last statement he'd make, I'd bring reporters and notes they would take. But it is finished were the last words that he'd say. You see, only God would have planned it that way. If I would have planned God's great love plan for me, I would not have sent Christ to die on that tree. But God knew my sin needed infinite pay. You see, only God would have planned it that way. If I'd planned how the Messiah would save, he would not spend 3 days closed up in the grave. But Christ rose from death that victorious day. You see, only God would have planned it that way. sometimes things don't always go how we plan or how we think that they should. But when we're talking about the Easter story and we're talking about God's plan for us, God has a beautiful plan that might not look what we think it should look like. But God has a way. We know that he has a way, and only God would have planned it this way. He planned it so that all of our sins would be forgiven, so that when we do those things that are wrong, when we don't listen to our parents, or when we fight with our friends, or when we just don't do what's right, well, we know that we should. God forgives us our sins because we're sorry, and because Christ died. But he didn't just die, he rose again. He rose from the grave, and he conquered sin, death, and the devil. And that's what's so special about Easter. And that's why we celebrate Easter, because only God would have planned it that way. He planned it that way, though, so that our sins could be forgiven, so that the whole world would be saved. And that's why I love Easter so much. It's so different from what we think it will be, and how we think it should be. But only God would have planned it that way, and only God's way, that's the very, very best way. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories from Holy Week. Have a great day. Bye.